Welcome, everybody, to my latest live weather and climate office hours. This session will be a little bit different than many of my sessions in that I'll be talking mainly about a national federal government agency. Now, if that sounds boring, I assure you, if you've tuned in before, this will likely be of great interest to anybody who's inclined to listen to me talk about weather or climate or related phenomena for the better part of an hour on a semi-regular basis. And the context in which I really want to talk about that agency, being the National Weather Service, is in the context of the now imminent upcoming election next week and how the outcome of this election, among being critically important for so many other reasons, could also profoundly reshape the way that we experience something as basic and fundamental as a freely available weather forecast in the United States. And I don't use this channel to share overtly political messages, and I won't do so today either. But I do want to reflect a little bit on what that actually means in the broader context of things. Because science, as practiced in the real world, of course, is never completely divorced from society and from politics, nor should it be, actually. In fact, science is deeply embedded within the context of whatever else is going on in the world around the scientists who engage in it as a practice. And so, individual scientists, of course, are human beings too, with their own personal views and their own political opinions and all of that. And so I think we do ourselves and science in general a disservice when we try to behave like automatons, which none of us, of course, really are. And one of the reasons why I use this kind of medium, these live virtual conversations, is so that to make it really obvious that we are also humans as weather and climate scientists, and that we can have conversations with people in settings that are more informal and that hopefully cause some new connections to be made in both directions. I get a lot of these sessions, as I know other folks do too, who watch them. And so all of this is to say, I'm going to focus on a very narrow aspect of what the stakes are in the upcoming election, and focus them on a public agency that is arguably, one might think, very uncontroversial, but has actually historically been the subject of much political discussion. And I think the real challenge is finding these narratives in the noise of everything else that's going on, because there are, of course, so many other things to be talking about in this consequential moment. But I just wanted to pick out a small aspect of that and really dive in, because I think it will be interesting and maybe a little bit illustrative regarding how the public weather enterprise works, first of all, here in the United States, how it's different from the way that equivalent public weather forecasting enterprises work in other countries around the world, and why I think, as somebody who is deeply enmeshed in this space and who works with lots of Weather Service employees over the years, why I think this would be really a shame, a travesty even, to lose, not just lose the entity entirely, which I think is unlikely, even given what we're going to talk about today, but even to lose the agency in its current form, which is arguably one of the most efficient, cost-effective, and tax dollar worthwhile endeavors that we do in this country in the modern era. So I want to dig into that in just a little bit. First, just a reminder that this channel is sponsored by Reask, a climate tech company that's rethinking extreme weather risk. And also, I wanted to offer a reminder to folks that there is a link to a new documentary on climate extremes and Earth system tipping points in the very first two comments in the live chat. I'll also embed a link to that to that documentary just a little bit later once the session ends, appended to this video. But this is a production that I both appear in and was heavily involved in the production of. So hopefully you find it worthwhile. I think it came out nicely, and I think it too will be of interest of most of the folks who show up for these live office hours. So again, the link is in the live chat. You can also find it elsewhere on my YouTube channel. So the National Weather Service in the United States, of course, is a federal government operation. It's actually housed within the broader agency NOAA, or the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which itself is located within the Department of Commerce. And NOAA actually represents a significant fraction of all of the funding that the Department of Commerce receives in the federal budget. So NOAA is a big part of the Commerce Department, and I think it's interesting to reflect a little bit on why NOAA is within the Department of Commerce as opposed to being somewhere else in the federal government. Sometimes in different countries, certain agencies end up in departments that are a little bit surprising or seemingly unlikely, for sort of historical reasons that are more of essentially relics of the way things used to be, rather than a reflection of their function in the modern era. But there may be a little bit of that here at the Department of Commerce, but quite frankly, by most metrics, this may still be a pretty appropriate home for NOAA and the National Weather Service, just given how important prediction of day-to-day weather is for the national economy, and in particular for GDP generating commercial activities within the country. And this is one of those things where the question of, okay, well, how many tax dollars do we spend producing this taxpayer-funded service, which is, again, this definitely qualifies as a public service agency whose primary objective is the protection of life and property as it pertains to extreme weather events. So the real, and by the way, folks, please do keep it civil in the comments section today. I know it's a little bit different than the conversation we normally have, but I really would appreciate it if folks could exercise a little bit of restraint. And so, as you see, I'm just having to do a little bit of real-time moderation here. But what I would like folks to reflect on is, if you can think of any particular occupation, any particular business that doesn't in some way, directly or indirectly, depend on the weather. And even if it doesn't ordinarily do so. So say 95, 99% of the time, you could operate your business pretty much in the absence of a weather prediction. And this may well be the case in some parts of, say, coastal California, where there is frequently pretty benign weather that doesn't greatly affect commercial activities. What about that other 5% or 1% of the time when there are extreme weather events, or even if it's not extreme, but say a significant heat wave that makes it difficult to do outdoor activities, or even just good old rain, not a huge flood, not a huge storm, but just wet roadways? Well, what do you know about what happens when it rains on the freeways in LA, for example, during rush hour? Well, everyone's commute is pretty well messed up. I think it's pretty safe to say. And that also affects people getting to work. It affects logistics. It affects moving goods and services around via vehicles on roads and streets and freeways. It affects air travel. There may be delays in commercial flights and goods getting to where they need to go. So just a basic example of how even a pretty run-of-the-mill weather event can affect virtually every commercial activity that's ongoing in a particular place under the right sets of conditions. Some businesses, some occupations obviously are more sensitive to this than others, but there's always about a 1 to 5% of the time situation that affects just about everybody, either because it's disruptive and it prevents usual commercial activities from happening, or it actively causes damage. So infrastructure is damaged, or transportation modalities are compromised, roads are flooded or washed out or something, or the power goes out, or there's damage to buildings in severe events. Just lots of examples, everything from how the mundane, ordinary conditions to more significant weather events and disasters can all affect commercial activities, and maybe they don't affect your personal business all that much day to day, but in aggregate, imagine how even if it only affects the operation of your small business by, I don't know, 1%, 3%, scale that up to every business in America, and that's a pretty big signal. And in some cases, of course, when we see these devastating extreme events, for example, probably most recently like the hurricanes in the southeastern U.S., but in particular Hurricane Helene, you first have all of the evacuation prep. People stop working, businesses close, people leave. You have to leave the area. There's supply chain interruptions. Then there's the storm making landfall along the coast, which of course causes major damage to people's homes and roads and infrastructure. That's tangible financial harm. Then the storm moves inland across Georgia and the Carolinas, and brought devastating floods, essentially decimating the entire transportation and telecommunications infrastructure, not to mention thousands and thousands of buildings, and then going on to kill hundreds of people. Obviously, there's a real human toll there. In that case, the death toll is in the hundreds, with hundreds more injured, and thousands of people displaced already now for weeks, and in many cases, likely for months to years in some of the most severely affected areas. So think about what that does to the local economy. There's plenty of small towns there that may never recover economically. The entire population base, the tax base, all of the commercial buildings in town were all destroyed in one fell swoop. Imagine what that does when you scale it up to dozens of small towns at once, like we saw during that event. It's a regional scale economic crisis on top of being a humanitarian one. And in California, of course, fortunately this year we haven't seen as devastating wildfires as we've seen at various points in the past decade. There have been a couple of highly destructive ones, including the Park Fire up north earlier in the summer and the Bridge Fire in Southern California earlier this fall. But just think back to what things were like, say, in 2017, 2020, when there were multiple towns essentially being destroyed by wildfire every year, and many thousands more, even hundreds of thousands or millions of people displaced, certainly millions of people affected by that episodic wildfire smoke. So imagine those horrible smoke days. That too greatly affects the economy. People become ill. Employers will cancel outdoor work, hopefully, for the sake of their employees. Schools close and their ER visits go way up. People get sick, people don't go to work, businesses close. And sometimes it's as simple as your employees might make it to work, you might not have to close, the power's still on, but who really wants to go out and grab a coffee if you're choking through dense, smoky air and it looks like Blade Runner sky? I mean, I'm sure there's some folks who still need their caffeine fix, but it's going to decrease the overall level of economic activity. Same too if there's an extreme heat wave. If it's record-breaking heat for days and days on end. So, for example, Phoenix, Arizona, which recently experienced 3 consecutive weeks where every single day brought a new record high temperature. That streak just ended, by the way, not only a number of days ago. People in Phoenix, of course, are used to the heat, but usually autumn offers a reprieve, and this year it just has not. And so what do you think that does to outdoor workers who might have avoided certain activities during the peak of summer, but things get scheduled? Projects, construction work, it gets scheduled for the fall when it starts to get cooler, but that didn't happen this year. So what happens is either those workers suffer through the extreme heat, or that work gets canceled until it cools off. That has a major economic impact as well. So just lots of examples of why, in fact, I think it does make sense for the National Weather Service and NOAA to be within the Department of Commerce, because frankly, that probably was the initial motivation for developing a national weather service, and it justifiably is probably one of the easiest ways to illustrate its continued value. And to that point, I do actually have some numbers to pull up. So I'm going to be looking a little bit off camera, a little bit more than I usually do, because I actually want to give some of the statistics here, because I think it's important to be specific, especially given present context. So NOAA, of course, has a public mandate primarily of protecting the public safety and the economy of the United States, and it does so. Well, it is specifically anyway in terms of the congressional mandate in the funding that it receives. Essentially, is tasked with operating and building and maintaining weather observational infrastructure. That includes everything from the surface weather stations, so those automated stations you see on the side of the road, at airports, on mountaintops and remote areas, but also the weather stations that have personnel at them at some of these facilities where these conditions are actively monitored. Doppler weather radar in the United States, all the Doppler weather radar sites are owned and operated again by the National Weather Service, and there are many of them dotted all around the country, usually quite a few per state, so this is relatively widespread infrastructure despite being quite expensive and complicated to maintain. Weather satellites, so all of the satellite imagery you see coming down the pike, whether you see it on your evening news or whether you search for it on the internet, all of that today is still primarily coming from, if not exclusively coming from, the federal government and the joint operation between NOAA and the National Weather Service and NASA that can involved in the operation of the satellites themselves. But it is NOAA that essentially designs these instrumentation platforms and uses them for operational weather prediction purposes. NOAA also runs all of the weather models you see. So in these other sessions, we talk about the American model, the GFS. And we talk about the high resolution models, so the NAM, the North American model, the HRRR, the high resolution rapid refresh model. These are all different weather models used in different contexts, and all are operated by essentially a branch of NOAA and used primarily by the National Weather Service in producing these high-quality weather forecasts that they do. The other thing that is important is the National Weather Service involves people who are stationed at local weather forecast offices scattered all throughout the country. And I think this is critically important, and it's somewhat unusual for an agency like this in an international context, if not rather unique, that there are dozens of individual local weather service offices all throughout the country. And I'll list just from memory the ones that are in California. There's one National Weather Service office in Eureka, so that serves the North Coast. There's one in Sacramento, which serves much of the interior of Northern California. There's one, it used to be in Redwood City, but now it's in Monterey, that serves the San Francisco and Monterey Bay areas. There's one in Hanford that serves the San Joaquin Valley as well as much of the Southern Sierra. There's one in Oxnard that serves much of the urban metros of Southern California, including the LA Metro. And then there's also one in San Diego, which serves the areas down as far south as the Mexican border. And there's also offices in Arizona that serve the southeastern Southeastern California deserts, as well as two other offices in other states that serve portions of Northern California. So that would be the Medford office in Oregon serving far Northern California, and the Reno, Nevada office serving parts of the easternmost and northeasternmost California. So think about that for a minute. That's a pretty long list of local offices that all have personnel on site 24 hours a day monitoring the weather conditions where you are. And I think the critical part of that is that in all of those cases, they have local expertise. So these are people who aren't stationed in some big stuffy office building in Silver Springs, Maryland, No offense to the folks who are. That's an important role too. But the key is that the Weather Service also operates these satellite offices, and it operates a lot of them. And a lot of the value in them is the fact that the people who work there develop a lot of pretty hyper-local knowledge about the places that they're forecasting for. So they develop not only sort of heuristic local knowledge of where weather models tend to be wrong, so sort of act as essentially using the human brain, what we're still trying to train artificial intelligence models to do, is to systematically and preemptively detect where the raw data from the weather models we have might be wrong, where you might need to apply adjustments, which cases you should believe the models pretty literally, in which cases you might want to view them, take them seriously but not literally, to use a turn of phrase that we've heard a lot of during this election cycle. But the point is, there is incredible value baked into this. I mean, this is not only a model that allows individual forecasters and staff to develop local intuitions, but it also allows them to develop local relationships. So the local Weather Service offices work very closely with the governor's office in specific states, or even with the offices of emergency management in individual cities and counties. In California, this means that the Weather Service offices, which are often, by the way, co-located with disaster response or emergency management agencies in some cases, especially when they're located in or near state capitals or regional centers, it means that there is an unprecedented level of close collaboration. And in many cases, there is a specific person that you can call to ask a question of 24 hours a day. That's especially true if you're working, say, for the mayor's office in a big city like San Francisco or Los Angeles. It's also true if you're the governor or you're the director of emergency operations at the whatever capacity in whatever place. But it also means that you don't have to get what some folks have described as the Washington runaround. So there's a lot of things the federal government does well. There's a lot of things it does not do very well, or certainly efficiently. I think we can all agree on that part. But this is arguably one of the things that it actually does extremely well, partly because it is, by design, decentralized. And so the National Weather Service has this local expertise. It makes that local expertise, well, on the one hand, it means that it exists. It means that there is a person that you, the taxpayer, even can call. I hesitate to illustrate this for fear of overly burdening the phone lines. But generally speaking, you can call up your local Weather Service office and get a meteorologist on the phone. Now, I would only recommend doing that if you have a specific reason to do so, so don't just call and chat. They're busy folks. But that is kind of unusual. And it actually is very different from the mental model that I think a lot of folks have about federal bureaucracy and inefficiency. This is, in some ways, the epitome of efficiency in the sense that you, the taxpayer, can directly engage with the tangible benefits that investment has brought about. And there's been a lot of talk about consolidating the National Weather Service in the name of efficiency over the years. That's not a new conversation, by the way. And in some cases, that has involved thinking about getting rid of a lot of these field offices. So, for example, either moving most folks to D.C. Or at least having 10 times fewer field offices and concentrating in the regional ones. And my personal view is that would be a significant mistake. And this is, by the way, irrespective of the current conversation surrounding policy proposals that are relevant to the election next week. This has been something that's already been under discussion for a long time. And no, I'm not a federal government insider, but my personal view is that there's a tremendous and sometimes underestimated value in having the personnel in local offices embedded essentially within the regions and the counties and the cities that they serve. I think there's many benefits to that, and it is arguably specifically that aspect of the decentralization that makes the National Weather Service function well in terms of its primary goal of protecting life and property. But I did say I wanted to get into the numbers, and I didn't actually do that. So let me do this. And so I have some scattered notes around. But to start off with, the Weather Service budget is, I believe, around. Let me double check my numbers here. But it's whatever you think it is. It's probably smaller because the estimated value of the services provided by the National Weather Service in terms of essentially economic losses averted is on the order of $35 billion. This is the most recent estimate of the value of the services provided by the Weather Service just for households. So this is excluding value to businesses. This is excluding peripheral value or additional value to the government itself. And of course, there is tangible value in the government providing itself with good information and avoiding bad investments and averting losses. But just for households, the individual tax-paying households that fund this critical public service, $35 billion is the estimate of the annualized value of those services, with an additional $15 to $20 billion value accruing to businesses. So there is the net commercial positive influence of the Weather Service on American society is on the order of $50 billion a year. That's a lot of money considering that the budget is only about $6 billion a year. Not 60, but 6. So depending on how you do the measurements, the estimate is essentially that the National Weather Service results in a return on investment of anywhere between a factor of about 5 and 10. So for every dollar you invest, the very most conservative estimate of the dollars that you either earn or don't lose as a collective society is anywhere from $5 to $10 per dollar invested. And I would challenge anybody to find a business model where a 5 to 10 times ROI is a bad investment. Most businesses would be thrilled with that return in a relative sense. And so, I think that really sets the stage for all of this, which is that this is, in any broader context, quite a lean and effective government agency that has benefits in many cases that are not fully tangible. So economists and various folks who work for the insurance companies, so the actuarial perspective on this, you can in fact put a generalized dollar value on a human life, for better or for worse. In economics, sometimes it's necessary, and it's a pretty high number, although perhaps not as high as you might imagine. But these numbers don't even account for that. The fact that the Weather Service is also saving lives as well as averting financial losses. And so you might argue that there's an intangible value in the hundreds, if not thousands, of lives that are saved, injuries and illnesses that are averted by having high-quality, freely available, real-time, 24/7 reliable weather forecasts available via any number of media. And speaking of the media, one interesting question that often comes up is, well, the Weather Service does all this stuff, but so does the TV. I see this stuff on the Weather Channel. You can go to AccuWeather.com. I can go to weather.com. I can get my own information there. So what is the government doing that the private sector isn't already doing? And here I think is a major fallacy that, to be quite honest, most of the commercial weather providers out there fully agree with. I don't think there's actually very many of them out there at this point who would disagree with what I'm about to say, which is that all of them could not exist, really. Certainly not in their current form, and arguably not at all, were it not for the investments that the U.S. federal government has made in NOAA and the National Weather Service before it. Because think about all of that observational data. The weather stations, the weather radars, the Earth-orbiting satellites, the weather models that are run on these large supercomputers. These are run in Maryland and Virginia, so we got to put them somewhere. All of that, plus the individual people who sift through this to make sense of all of the noise and create a signal through all the data. Most of that is not something that was going to earn anybody any money. All of that is just sunk costs if you're a business. And it sunk costs in the tens and tens of billions of dollars over the years, many tens of billions of dollars, before you had any direct financial return if a business were to do this. And the interesting part about that is that there is, as I said, quite a lot of commercial value in these forecasts and this data being available. But somebody has to pay for it first. Somebody has to develop it and make that initial investment. And who has done so historically? It has been the federal government. And arguably, it's been a hugely successful investment for the reasons I've been talking about. But essentially, it would be a non-starter if the private sector had to do all of this from scratch. If you had to develop a national network of high-quality weather instrumentation, and then install it, and then monitor it, and then maintain it, and then interpret it, and then ingest it into models, and then build a fleet of Earth-orbiting satellites, and then build a fleet of ground-based terrestrial radars, among many other systems that exist, you'd be pretty far in the hole to start out. And so the point is, this is one of those things that is a public service, and the commercial weather enterprise as it exists today could not exist but for these enormous public investments made before it. And that has been largely a synergistic relationship. I don't think that's a bad thing, that there's a layer of commercial weather services that exist on top of this backbone that's publicly funded. I think that that's entirely reasonable. But sometimes when folks say the private sector can replace the federal government in this capacity, I think they're completely missing why the private sector it can exist at all as it does in the first place. And so there's clearly a high return on investment. This is clearly not something the private sector can do on its own from scratch. And there have long been conversations, and again, I'm going to get to the election in a moment, but there have long been conversations about why it's important to privatize weather in the U.S. and why we should move all of these functions from the government to the private sector. And I think almost all of the people who've made these proposals have very little knowledge of what actually goes into producing a weather forecast. The enormous amount of background investment, the enormous amount of personnel that are involved, the value of having people, human forecasters who understand why your coastal valley might have different conditions than the valley 10 miles over. That's generally not something that we're going to be able to get from a lean national commercial weather forecast provider. Arguably, not if we centralized everything to DC in the federal government either. But there's tremendous value in this that is both tangible and intangible. And the tangible value, the quantifiable dollar value, is already enormous and many multiples of the underlying investment. But there's also this intangible aspect that I think is maybe a little bit, it's important, but it's critical, but it's a little bit harder to quantify. So I want to now turn to the election right now, because, as I said, this is a hugely consequential election, and quite frankly, there are two very different choices on the ballot, and I know many folks are not thrilled with either choice, but it is still a choice, and there are still fundamental differences between them. And one of the pieces of consideration I think that's important to reflect on, among very many other things, and of course there isn't just any one thing that anybody should focus on. I think we do have to look at the big picture and things like this always, is what some of the actual policy proposals are for how things could go differently in 2025 depending on the outcome of this election. And there's a document called Project 2025 that's been circulated. There's been lots of news articles about it. I'm sure all of you who are listening have already heard of it. And there's a lot of argument about what it is and isn't. And what it is, literally, is a document that was written primarily by folks at the Heritage Foundation, an entity that weather and climate scientists, by the way, have been familiar with for many years, because it's long been a hotbed of climate denial and suppression of accurate scientific information about climate change. But this is a document that was produced. It's a pretty comprehensive read, and I actually do suggest that folks read it, or at least read portions of it. It is available. It's been archived online, even though the Heritage Foundation, I believe, took it down from their website once it started getting some negative press. But you can still read it. I actually pulled it up again today, an archived version of it, just to fact check myself, frankly, and take a look at what it actually says. So I'm not inferring what it says from other people or from news articles, but I've pulled some direct quotes from it. And I also want to offer some broader context surrounding this document, which is to say that at least as far as I can tell, and I haven't read the whole thing, it's actually voluminous, it's a very long document, wide-ranging document. The purpose of the document, as is stated in the document and has been articulated in the real world in recent months, is that it essentially is a policy blueprint. So no, it's not a proposed legislation in itself per se. It's not a legally binding document. I am 100% sure that not everything in this document would come to pass, regardless of how the election goes. However, it is a very comprehensive document that I think quite clearly articulates a wide range of policy goals and potential and desirable outcomes, or outcomes that are perceived as being desirable by the authors of this document. And the other thing is that most of what's in here, from the portions that I've read, it doesn't come out of left field. So these are not policy positions that are completely different or orthogonal to things we've heard before as weather and climate scientists working in the space for years. But it is the first time I've ever seen it put in a document where it says, with the explicit intent, that this is something that we would like to put into motion as soon as possible. And the goal of this Project 2025 document is to offer a blueprint for how to quickly and efficiently prioritize actions at the executive level and at the federal level to push through very quickly a large, wide-ranging, and quite frankly pretty radical range of new policies, including the dismantling or reorganization of most federal agencies. But it's interesting that this document, despite covering a lot of things that people are probably more familiar with the current electoral cycle, it actually has a pretty substantive chunk of it devoted to NOAA and the National Weather Service. There's at least 4 full pages in this document devoted to the Weather Service. And I've read and reread them, and I just wanted to reflect on what is actually said in these pages right now. And I do want to point out one thing as I start here. There have been folks who have said that this is a document that is unconnected to any particular political party or candidate for president or otherwise, and that this is a document that's been disavowed by politicians on both sides, that this was an independent entity that wrote this up without really any particular coordination with politicians. And I will just directly quote something that former President Donald Trump said last year, or I believe it was a year and a half ago, and that it's specifically that, quote, Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation will lay the groundwork and detail plans for exactly what our movement will do. That's a direct quote. So there's been movement away from that, of course, in public. But I think I'm generally an advocate for believing people when they tell you pretty explicitly that they're going to do something and that they're going to try and do something. And so I think that's the relevant context for the rest of this. So as I mentioned, there's 4 pages in Project 2025 devoted to NOAA and the Weather Service. And so it's pretty clear that considerable thought went into this portion of the document. This was not just a perfunctory paragraph thrown in there somewhere. The document describes NOAA as a primary component of the, and I quote, climate change alarm industry, and it should be, quote, broken up and downsized. But it goes into some more specifics beyond that point. So specifically regarding the National Weather Service, the document says that it, quote, should focus on its data gathering services, end quote, and then, a new quote, should fully commercialize its forecasting operations. Another longer passage says that each day, quote, Americans rely on weather forecasts and warnings provided by local radio stations and colleges that are produced not by the National Weather Service, but by private companies such as AccuWeather. Studies have found that the forecasts and warnings provided by private weather companies are more reliable than those provided by the National Weather Service, end quote. So first of all, that's a false statement about the forecast being more reliable. There's actually evidence that the reverse is true in many cases, but it's difficult to quantify in any case. But the deeper thing here, I think it's important to read between the lines, which is to say, clearly the focus here is to remove the function of the Weather Service in the U.S. as an agency focused on the public good. Essentially, it's saying that the commercialization of the Weather Service would remove the mandate of the agency to primarily protect life and property in the country. What it sounds like it's saying, although it doesn't come out and say it directly, is that the Weather Service should no longer have a role in weather prediction, which is kind of wild. Essentially, it says that essentially it should become a data collection agency. So there is support for maintaining the Weather Service in a capacity that it maintains these observational weather networks that can feed into commercial weather providers, but essentially do nothing else. Not issue warnings, not issue forecasts, no longer be a human meteorologist you can call on the phone. So to me, that is what this says. And it also embeds what I mentioned earlier about there being this rather widespread but significant fallacy that these commercial enterprises can exist independent of the Weather Service. Now, I guess maybe there's a little bit of implicit acknowledgement of that, because essentially the document says that the Weather Service should be a data collection only service, which I guess acknowledges in a bit of a backhanded way how important that data collection is for the commercial weather enterprise. But what happens to the weather models that are run and interpreted by NOAA? What happens? Who's going to provide those forecasts, those weather forecasts, the next time there's a big hurricane or atmospheric river or extreme wildfire event? Are you going to have to sign up for a monthly subscription through Amazon that gets more and more expensive every 6 months? Are you going to have to listen to ads before the next tornado warning? I'm mostly being sarcastic, but quite honestly, I don't know, because that certainly seems to be within the realm of possibility. And in fact, that is how it works in some other places in the world, where there aren't well-functioning, easily accessible public weather forecasting utilities. There are many countries around the world where the national meteorological services are in like a small office at the main international airport and employs maybe 5 or 10 people for the whole country. There are generally more people in the Weather Service local forecast office in some random county somewhere in the U.S. than some countries' entire national meteorological organizations. And so you can imagine that they don't function at the same level. You can't get high quality, constantly updated, quality controlled, locally contextualized weather predictions for every square inch of the earth unless you have the infrastructure and the people available to do it. And we do right now in the US. But this is not the state of things elsewhere in the world. And there's even been some moves to privatize other national meteorological agencies in recent years. In fact, this actually happened largely in New Zealand not so long ago, where the Met Service was essentially split into one government-owned enterprise that had to be responsible for its own funding. So essentially, it had to be a self-sustaining organization. They converted what was once a public utility into a nonprofit company that had to essentially recoup all of its own funding. So it turned it into a commercial weather provider, more or less, with some public mandate. And then the rest of the agency got spun off into a climate research agency. So still a government-funded research organization. And by all accounts, from folks who live there, meteorologists and climate scientists included, this was essentially a disaster. This was a decision that a lot of people in New Zealand regret, and the Weather Service does not function as well as a public utility as it once did. But now that this has happened, it's hard to bring the horses back in the barn after the fact. And there are other countries who have tried to do this too, but there are a lot of other countries around the world where we have never had this opportunity to begin with, where there's never been a very well-funded public weather service in the way that we have with the NWS in the U.S. And I actually want to quote a meteorologist who founded and is currently the senior meteorologist for a major private sector weather company. His name is Paul Douglas, and I have his permission to quote him directly on this. I'm just going to read the passage verbatim as he sent it to me in response to some questions about this very topic. So this is from Paul Douglas. My last weather company, and this whole thing is a quote, by the way. My last weather company is Predictix, a bit of a tongue twister, where we consult with weather-sensitive businesses, and some might argue it's in my best financial interest to support Project 2025. But frankly, it's a recipe for chaos, confusion, and needless weather-related deaths. Breaking the National Weather Service into pieces and letting private industry start issuing competing consumer-facing watches and warnings will result in anarchy and higher death tolls from increasingly extreme weather disasters at a time when all weather is being flavored by a rapidly warming climate. In a nation that experiences more extreme weather than any country on Earth, we are playing with fire if this is ever implemented. Again, it's unclear on whether Project 2025 data gathering applies to analysis and forecasting, including severe weather alerts. The language is probably purposefully vague and ambiguous. But while continuing to modernize and improve the Weather Service as a mission-critical and inevitable, handing over big chunks of its operational mission to the private sector would be a mistake of biblical proportions. So that's end of quote from Paul Douglas at Predictix. I think the real challenge here, well, there are multiple challenges here, but I think the real issue is that this is one of those things that we take for granted in the U.S. And again, there are so many other reasons that this isn't a consequential election, that this may be rightfully pretty far down your list of priorities, though perhaps a bit higher on it than many folks, given that you've been on this live stream for 45 minutes listening to me talk about it. But I think it's something that we would really, really miss in ways that we probably would be irreplaceable if it were gone. And that's true even if the Weather Service continues in some form, as it almost certainly would. I don't think that it's likely that the Weather Service, regardless of outcome, would simply disappear, or that NOAA would, either, for that matter. But if it stopped existing in its current, relatively well-functioning form, certainly relative to other meteorological organizations on Earth, and certainly from a overall fiscal responsibility perspective, that 5 to 10 ROI for a $6 billion agency is pretty damn good, if you ask me, compared to many other federal government expenditures. Again, something that I think many folks can probably agree upon. But if it goes away, it's probably not going to come back, because once you dismantle something like this, policy-wise, administratively, or in terms of funding, the reality is it is extraordinarily difficult to reassemble what has been an emergent, successful entity over decades. So that's one perspective on this, but I actually want to read a little bit more directly from Project 2025. So again, I'm going to quote again from the document. This is regarding, in a different section about the Weather Service, regarding the need to downsize and or disband the Weather Service itself, or other entities within NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which is the broader umbrella within which the Weather Service is located. And again, quote, the OAR, or the NOAA Office of Research, is the source of much of NOAA's climate alarmism. The preponderance of its climate change research should be disbanded. OAR is a large network of research laboratories, an undersea research center, and several joint research institutes with universities, end quote. So by the way, that would include a bunch of university partnerships. It would include the National Center for Atmospheric Research. This is talking not directly about the National Weather Service now, but about other entities under the auspices of NOAA. And OAR is a grant giving entity within NOAA that sponsors a lot of the research through competitive grants. So you apply, there's a review process, they reject the vast majority of these applications, but some of them get funded, and that is how science advances. This is how we have better weather forecasts in the US, better climate predictions. But I think there's another real misunderstanding here too, but I want to go on, again continuing with the direct quote from the document, that, quote, data collected by the department, being NOAA, should be presented neutrally without adjustments intended to support any one side of the climate debate. Together, these form a colossal operation that has become one of the main drivers of the climate change alarm industry and is thus, or as such, is harmful to future U.S. prosperity, end quote. So really what this is saying is a number of things that are objectively incorrect, but what it is specifically saying is that NOAA should muzzle its scientists and not pursue climate research. In fact, it's actually saying that the agency would be encouraged to have a mandate to essentially commit scientific malpractice by not including the increasingly prominent effect of climate change either in research or in operations, meaning that if we know that the risk of a rapidly intensifying hurricane or an extreme wildfire or a severe rain event is higher than it used to be, the agency would not be allowed to use that information in trying to save lives and property. Think about that for a minute. And then finally, this is the last quote I'm going to read from the document. The quote is, "This industry's mission, emphasis on prediction and management, seems designed around the fatal conceit of planning for the unplannable," end quote. And personally, I actually think that is the most egregious piece of this document's focus on the National Weather Service and NOAA. And I hadn't seen this particular quote pulled out in any of the news coverage surrounding this, but I actually think it's maybe the worst bit of all. Again, I'm going to read it again for emphasis. Quote, "This industry's mission emphasis on prediction and management seems designed around the fatal conceit of planning for the inevitable," end quote. Essentially, what it's saying is that planning for disasters and extreme events is a fool's errand. That we shouldn't be preparing for disasters. We shouldn't be preparing for extreme events. We shouldn't be using federal dollars to prevent bad things from happening. And quite frankly, I think that is the most absurd thing that I've seen in this space. And that is saying quite a lot. That is the whole point of the entire enterprise of weather prediction. What is the point of predicting the weather if not to foresee large events, storms, floods, droughts, disasters, severe wildfire conditions, and then do something about them? Do something to prevent those hazards from becoming disasters. Otherwise, what is the point? Why do we even care? And so it's both a very dark view on what the point of science is, of what trying to avert harm in a general sense is, but it's also completely antithetical to the literal, congressionally stated mandate of the Weather Service, which is to protect life and property, and to do so in a way that is an efficient use of taxpayer dollars, which it does. But the idea that we can't, and more importantly, and more confusingly, shouldn't try to predict the future to prevent those bad outcomes is just such an unbelievably incorrect way to think about meteorology and climate science, and this notion that the climate science is an industry of unnecessary alarm and exaggeration. That's a slightly different conversation that I don't really think we have the time for today. But I just wanted to emphasize what's in here. I'm not making this up. You can go read it for yourself. This document is available. Even though the Heritage Foundation pulled it off their website, it was up there for long enough that a gazillion people got copies. And no, I think it's very unlikely that if that every single proposal within this huge, enormous, wide-ranging document would be immediately implemented by a new Trump administration. I agree that it's very unlikely that would happen. But that's only because there's so much there. And these proposals are not out of left field. It's not as if the first time we've ever heard them come in this document, but these have been floating around for years. And I think it's one of those things where there's certain people who've just been itching to take out the Weather Service and give it over to the private sector, whatever that means, even though that wouldn't work. Because, of course, as I mentioned, all of the backbone of the private sector weather industry is still this federally funded, taxpayer-subsidized arrangement. And historically, that's worked fine because the taxpayers get a whole hell of a lot out of it still, even though there is this layer of commercial weather enterprises that piggybacks on the top and does add value on top of that information. The government doesn't have an unlimited funding. It doesn't have unlimited ability to do everything to produce all of the forecasts, all of the products that are desired by businesses and individuals. So great, the private sector comes in and does that. That's good. I think that's a good example of public-private synergy, and there could be more of that. I think that, I think that is a positive vision for the future. But this idea that somehow this is an ineffective agency that is a megaphone of exaggeration and alarm, unnecessary expenditure of tax dollars that isn't worth it to the people, the taxpayers essentially, and doesn't have hugely positive externalities throughout society that cascade even throughout, not just throughout the US, but even beyond other nations as well, I think is a real misread on the situation. And I'm not going to talk about the rest of this document because it's not really my place to talk about it in this setting. I obviously have my own personal views and political views, and of course I've already voted in this election. And I really hope you do too. And I hope that this, among other things, is on your mind as you do so. Because as I mentioned, there's not just one thing that's important in this or any other election. And this is a particularly consequential one, where I know tensions are running high, and it's going to be, quite frankly, a week where the tension between wanting to pay attention to the news and not wanting to pay attention to the news is going to be tough, I think, for a lot of folks. And hopefully things calm down later in November. But I just wanted to illustrate that even things that are seemingly mundane are potentially at stake in this election. And that has not always been the case in other elections in my own lifetime, collectively in our lifetimes. And so I just wanted to zoom in on this one little piece of things that I think I can speak relatively authoritatively about, just given my own career and my own personal experience in this space, and reflect on what that would mean and the effects that even something as seemingly minor in the scheme of things as dismantling of the U.S. National Weather Service or a reorienting of its mandate away from the protection of life and property would have on everybody, on the economy, on the individual safety, and even in our the way that the U.S. is viewed on the international stage, because the National Weather Service of the United States is a national gem. It is something that people in other countries recognize as something the U.S. got right. Why would we get rid of that, especially given how incredibly cost-effective it is, given that 5 to 10 times ROI, especially in a year like this one, where the Weather Service has played an outsized role in people's lives all around the country, given the relatively extreme volume of extreme weather events we've seen, including some record-breaking ones that 50, 60, 70 years ago probably would have killed hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, but this time killed 10 to 100 times fewer people and resulted in many billions of dollars less in damages than otherwise would have been the case. That's just this year so far. So I think I'll leave folks with that, and I really hope that this was helpful for some folks out there. And I have been paying extremely close attention to the comments today, but I will quickly skim through them now. This may not be a day where I'll take a whole lot of questions, but I do want to see what folks are saying. Hopefully it's relatively civil in the comments section, so just give me a second here. All right, here. Thanks for keeping it civil, folks. That really does mean. Hey, how many comment sections on the internet these days are readable? This one is. The comment section on Weather West is, and so I'm grateful for that. It's a bit of a community that's fostered, and frankly, I don't know exactly what the secret sauce is, but it does seem to work most of the time. Yeah, several folks pointed out there are several people who are farmers who are in the live chat right now and who I interact with on a somewhat regular basis. That's another example that I didn't even mention, maybe because it was so obvious, but this weather information is like 100% mission critical for any sort of agriculture. And there are private weather providers that give more ag-specific information sometimes, but where does the backbone for all of that come from? It's still the Weather Service. And I think farmers, perhaps better than a lot of other people, recognize this pretty acutely in California, in the Southwest, and just generally in the U.S. Several folks are mentioning the personal interactions they've had with individual Weather Service meteorologists at their local office. And again, that's a thing that can happen. You can have those interactions, and they can be hugely helpful and valuable. Yeah, a couple folks have mentioned that the AFDs, which is an acronym for the Area Forecast Discussions, I've actually thought about this. I've spoken with a couple of archivists from the National Archives, and the AFDs are the Area Forecast Discussions. These are either 2 or 3 times daily documents. Technically, they are public record federal documents produced by local meteorologists in your local Weather Service office multiple times every single day. They're essentially short essay length. In many cases, they're 500 to 1,000 words. Again, twice a day from every Weather Service office in the country, talking about both the short and long-term forecasts, and they're free form. These are not, highly regimented form letters. I've seen forecasters crack jokes, mention that so-and-so is retiring from the office after 30 years of service, write an acrostic poem that's relevant to the weather. All of these things, of course, are relevant to the weather, but they're done in clever ways. But the more important thing is you can get really critical insights into the local meteorology in ways that looking at a little icon on your smartphone weather app is never going to show. And so those area forecast discussions, I think, are both a real-time, incredible tool if you have interest or knowledge in meteorology, or you have specific concerns, you want to know the qualitative context of the quantitative forecast that they're producing. But they're also just really cool documents. I mean, where else in the federal government are there, essay-length documents produced twice a day that are in the personal style of whoever's on duty at the moment and can include just about anything that's relevant to local meteorology that you can imagine in any form that you want. Sometimes forecasters will reflect on historical events or the current event in their historical recollection. Again, all of this is incredibly valuable. And I hope that someone is maybe writing a book on these someday, because this is almost a very honest historical archive of sorts, in ways that other federal documents are not. Anyway, just another thing that you may not have known that your tax dollars are supporting. Yeah, even more people reflecting on the personal interactions they've had with National Weather Service meteorologists. Just showing that, of the couple hundred people who've attended this live session, more than a handful of them have interacted with these specific people and this specific organization. Yes, I agree. I do think that one of the strangest conceits in all of this is that we shouldn't be trying to avert bad outcomes by predicting them and thereby trying to attenuate their impacts preemptively or even reactively. I mean, that there is, there's a disaster response. There are some things you can't prevent, but you got to respond to. But even that is almost impossible if you don't have good information about what has happened, what's going to happen, and when it's going to happen, and where. There's a quote from that someone mentioned, that Stefan Rahmstorf, who is, by the way, also heavily featured in the documentary that I mentioned, that I encourage everybody who's listening to this live stream watch, the link to which is at the beginning of the live chat and also will be made available after this. But that he said essentially that if we should manage the unavoidable so that we can avoid the unmanageable, and I think that's an important societal philosophy. It is how I live my own personal life, I will tell you that much, but it's also, I think, how we have to live in the real world, where we never know exactly what's going to happen, but we have some foresight, and we also have some ability to prepare for bad things and to mitigate them critically. As I've mentioned, a lot of these things, these aren't exogenous, magical alien laser beams. If that were the case, maybe we would really be screwed, but it's not. A lot of the challenges that we face are within our control to manage, and even things we can't directly control, like the weather, we can certainly prepare for it and we can predict it. And by affecting what the level of climate change is that we're going to see moving forward, we can also, in the long run, even influence the changes we're going to see in those extreme weather conditions to begin with. A few additional shout outs to those area forecast discussion aficionados out there. They really are fun documents to read, and again, it's free to read them. So if you're interested, I would suggest folks check it out. One example that Steve pulled out of the most recent, literally from this afternoon, the area forecast discussion from the Weather Service in Monterey, is that it's perhaps a good day for the procrastinators to visit the pumpkin patch, given the expectation of some rain coming in later. That's nice and informal, and yet actually it communicates something that is probably on some folks' minds right now. And it does so in a way that is, not overly rigid or formal. It's accessible. All right. Well, I think thanks for everybody. I'm actually really impressed with the comment section, folks, today. I know this is a little bit different conversation type than I normally have. I really don't get into the politics of things, even though, again, science in general is not devoid of politics, certainly not weather and climate science, which is unfortunate. I do wish that science was less partisan, because it can be political without being partisan. And I think the problem today is that science, and climate science in particular, has become partisan. It is very unfortunate, by the way, that it is so easy to discern what one's political preferences are from one's views on climate change. It shouldn't be that way. In fact, in a lot of countries in the world, it's much less true than in the US. So that's not a foregone conclusion. And also, science and society is always going to be a bit messy, and that's just the nature of things. But I think we really ought to be able to agree on some semblance of a common shared reality, and I think that too is what's on the ballot right now, both figuratively and literally next week. And I think that, to solve any of the challenges that we've talked about, both today and in this channel, I think we really do need to find a way to agree on the way the world is now, at least, and then have differences of opinion on how to deal with that reality. I think that's probably the best hope for a constructive path forward in all of this. And so with that, I guess that's the end of the ode to the National Weather Service that I wanted to give today as an example of a federal agency that's doing very good work in a very fiscally responsible way that I sincerely hope is continued to be allowed to do so for many years to come. So with that, get out there and please do vote. There's still plenty of time, and I'll see you all next week. Until then.